know that feeling when you return home from a seemingly boring and never-ending day at school or work? You plop down on your couch, scroll social media a bit, take a sip from your favorite soft drink, get comfortable, and boot up your PC to play some video games. Ah yes, finally time to relax. You've been dreaming about this moment from the start of the day to just be done with your responsibilities and chill out. Most of us picture this scenario right here as something blissful, especially if we're working or studying most of the day. However, we seem to never think about the aftermath of engaging in this type of comfortable pleasure. Eating junk food, sitting around scrolling on social media, playing video games, watching porn, and doing drugs one way or another end up in us crashing, craving more, and most definitely not relaxing. So why does this happen? I mean, we can't always be working or studying. We have to relax from time to time, right? Well, of course. But what we usually choose to wind down with are cheap dopamine sources. So in this video, I'll explain what these are and how they can be the reason for you feeling like crap and craving to live a better life. I'll also provide steps to overcome cheap dopamine. However, you most likely won't like it when you hear it, and only a few of you will actually stick around to the end to hear this uncomfortable truth. I talked about dopamine and its effects before, but here's a quick summary of what dopamine is and does if you don't know. So dopamine is a chemical inside of your brain that is responsible for motivation and pleasure associated with that motivation. Whenever you get the craving to do anything, think about doing something or actually do the thing. The main character behind the scenes is dopamine. However, we don't have an unlimited amount of dopamine. We have what is called the baseline level of dopamine, the amount of dopamine circulating in our system currently. Whenever you think about something you desire or do an activity that's pleasurable, the dopamine in your blood peaks above that baseline. Of course, that's all well and good until you realize that after this peak, the baseline dopamine gets used up. If you engage in this very stimulating and cheap pleasure like video games, you get a very high peak in dopamine for a bit, and then the baseline drops further down. Now spend the whole day gaming and you use up all your dopamine. This can also happen if you just game for a couple hours. The result, you feel like a zombie and are not able to engage in less stimulating but more important things. And that's how this pleasure, these cheap dopamine sources, ruin your life. Sure, maybe after doing your responsibilities for the day, you think that it doesn't matter if you engage in this cheap dopamine as you don't need to work or do anything else important. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. You see, dopamine baseline is not that easily replenished. If you play video games for 4 hours and go to sleep, you can probably relate that you don't wake up feeling refreshed, ready to attack the day. You wake up groggy, craving more stimulation, and feeling even more pain and discomfort if you have to do anything less stimulating. Because of this, you then engage in cheap dopamine hits throughout the day, like scrolling on social media on your breaks or eating junk food or smoking and on. The cycle repeats itself. Days, weeks, months, and years spent like this take a toll on both your physical and mental health, and you can probably feel it right now. On the other side of the coin, if there are cheap dopamine sources, there must be healthy and natural dopamine sources as well. And there in fact are. But this is the part where 99% of people won't like it. Natural dopamine sources are difficult to engage in at the start. They are less stimulating and harder to do, especially if you're used to highly stimulating sources. I mean, just think about it. Would you rather read a book for 2 hours or play video games for 2 hours? Most of you can barely even focus on reading a tweet.
Boom. Roasted.
So the answer will be video games, an activity that just feels good for a bit, but ultimately doesn't provide anything for the person engaging in it. Whereas reading books, learning skills, or working on something meaningful might not seem attractive, but actually provide insane benefits both for the improvement of your life and the general calmness of it. Working and learning are natural dopamine sources and also provide dopamine peaks. However, for skill building and productivity, to become as engaging as video games, it will take time and sacrifice, but it is worth it to try. So here's how to protect yourself. To start off, you need to create and follow a new mentality. Understand that both cheap dopamine and natural dopamine sources have short-term and long-term effects. The choices you make in your life matter. They affect your life. Cheap dopamine sources feel awesome in the moment, in the short term, but long-term damage your life in terms of making you weak, lazy, and unproductive. Whereas natural dopamine sources at first might not seem very enjoyable or beneficial, but over time help you actually relax and improve your life at the same time. As Hamza likes to say, do the hard things even when you don't feel like it. Now, if you've been using cheap dopamine for a long time and it's really affecting your life, you probably need a reset, which is often called a dopamine detox. This exercise is the key in order to get your life back in control and stop being a slave to cheap dopamine. You might think that a dopamine detox means just not engaging in highly stimulating cheap dopamine, But that's not always the case. It all comes down to you and your lifestyle. The classic dopamine detox is not engaging in any cheap dopamine at all. That includes things like video games, social media, smartphone use, sugar, and other sources of cheap dopamine. It's also possible to get benefits by just limiting and reducing the amount of exposure you have to these as well. You won't get as many benefits as doing a full dopamine detox, but it certainly will provide a lot of benefits to your life, and you will notice motivation improvements. The most important thing is to look at your life, see how cheap dopamine is affecting it, and then start regulating yourself accordingly. You need to identify which cheap dopamine sources affect your life the most. Perhaps you don't have a problem with binge watching TV shows on Netflix, but you do have a problem with gaming. Perhaps watching long form YouTube videos isn't causing issues, but TikTok videos, you get lost. You want to identify where your issues are and set the appropriate boundaries. And if you can't, if you don't feel under control in that way, then you probably need to take an extended break. I have a full guide on doing a dopamine detox in the description of this video. And so if you want to do that, I definitely recommend at least 30 days to see the most benefits. Now, during this time, if you're removing yourself from different sources of dopamine, you want to find good replacements. So things like reading books, going outside to nature, hanging out with friends in real life, working on meaningful tasks, learning new skills, volunteering, and contributing to your community can all be great replacements. Remember, engaging in this type of dopamine source might not feel good at the start, but with time, it will be much more rewarding than any cheap dopamine source you've ever had. Now, sometimes bringing more awareness to how these cheap dopamine sources are affecting your life can be really beneficial. So check out this video on what modern comforts are ruining your life.